Hello, my name is Zack, and today I'm going to be talking about scalable application architecture. So I can speak Thai พูดภาษาไทยได้นะครับแต่ว่าทางงานเขาขอให้พูดภาษาอังกฤษแต่ว่าอยากบอกไว้ก่อนจะได้ถ้ามีคำถามอะไรก็ถามมาได้ครับเป็นภาษาไทยก็ได้ So I'm gonna be talking about my journey into building applications with React. So after I started with React, a lot of other things came out, Vue.js and all that stuff. So I ran into the same problem that a lot of people did, which is like the JavaScript fatigue, because there's no one way to do anything, and then everyone just wants to.
อันนี้แค่เข้ากล้องมันต้องใช้ไมค์ด้วยครับ
อ๋อโอเค ได้ละ Okay. So in JavaScript land, everyone just wants to create a new library every week because, I don't know, it's so easy and there's like 500 different variations of languages like TypeScript and Babel, and in Babel you can use different plugins and presets. So if you combine it, I'm sure there's like thousands of combinations of syntax even. So coming from Ruby and Elixir, where there's like a set way, it's one syntax, it's like one way to do something, or you can do things in multiple ways, but there are conventions and standards and great defaults, right? And none of that stuff exists in JavaScript. So when I came into React, I was looking for something which is repeatable, like a repeatable process. Because one thing I believe is that a good technology should have some kind of repeatable process because it increases productivity. If things change all the time and there's a new standard every other day, then you have to keep changing the standard and you're not focusing on building your actual application. So instead of actually just jump in and start building, I did a lot of research into what are the best practices, what are the standards in the JavaScript community. There are some people who have come up with things that make it very easy to build applications. For example, the Ember.js community. I think they've done a great job in terms of giving that convention and great defaults like out of the box so that you can just get productive right away. But React intrigued me enough to go on this journey. So that's why I kind of went on this, even though there's already an existing solution, and that's one great solution. But having options is also something which is nice. So I come from the background of Ruby on Rails and Phoenix, which is why I talk about conventions and the great defaults and having everything set up for you, like the architecture, the design patterns, everything already set up for you out of the box. So that's kind of like where I'm coming from. I've been doing Rails for 6-7 years now, and just started Phoenix this last year. So I notice a lot of patterns, and that's why I kind of want to apply some of that idea to React and JavaScript. So React.js, that's why we're all here. Nothing included, no opinions, no conventions. That's React.js. So even if we talk about something which is very basic, like the routing layer, even Facebook doesn't use React Router. So, and React Router has been a bit of a pain point for me because it's a very good library and it works, but it also has a lot of things which I don't understand why. Like the people who made the React Router, they keep trying to solve the problem again and again and again. I don't know who here uses React Router. Okay, and you know that when you change from React Router 3 to React Router 4, nothing works anymore. Like absolutely nothing. There's not even one part that's left that's the same. So that's kind of like the frustrations that I had to face in terms of with the JavaScript community. So I'm not just here to complain, so I'm going to offer a solution as well. So let's talk a little bit about React Router. And one of the things that I ran into, which frustrated me a lot, was that I see this a lot in JavaScript community, which is that they try to solve the problem in one very focused area. So like, for example, let's solve the routing layer. OK, great. Now that works, let's solve it again. Instead of looking at the big picture and building applications like an integrated system, like that's what Rails and Phoenix and all that stuff is it's an integrated system. They have a routing layer, and it hasn't changed for the past, I don't know how many years it's been. It's like at least 3-4 years it hasn't changed, and it's stable, it's repeatable, right? That's one of the concepts that's really missing from the JavaScript community. So React Router is one primary example of that, right? Just the people who make the router, they just keep building a better router where we don't need a better router. We need like the whole big picture, the design patterns and the conventions on how to build applications. So that's kind of like one of the frustration that kind of like led me to get JavaScript fatigue, and I'm sure it's led to many other people as well. So I decided that to fully understand and be able to come up with a solution, I had to start from scratch. And so the first thing that at the time when I started, which was I think about 6 to 7 months ago, was that I wanted this experience to be fun and happy, right? Like, so in the Ruby community, we have this, this idea that programmers should be happy, right? Because happy programmers build better apps. So basically, that's kind of like how I set out. And I realized that to be able to do that, you have to have great defaults, dry, so don't repeat yourself, and great conventions. So one of the other goal I wanted to really start out with is having clean separation from the back end. So if you ever build an application right now, it's one thing to figure out how to build a front end, but now front end is so complex. It used to be that we just use HTML, CSS, and we sprinkle some jQuery on top. But now front end is its own application. It has its own routing. It has its own state management. It has its own view layer. So it's very, very, like it's its own application now. It's like building for the browser now. It's like building for iOS or Android. So there's no difference. Like when we build an iOS app, we don't put it in our backend directory structure. We keep a separate repository. So that's one of the goals I wanted to achieve, which is to have a clean separation from the back end, which means the back end will just be the pure API. Whether it's RESTful or GraphQL, whatever it is, it's completely separate, and it only has to worry about back end stuff. So the front end then is the story that we want to explore here. So I wanted to have a back end agnostic framework where I could use multiple backends. So this was one of the goals as well. Like, so if you imagine for a second, sometimes you're building your front-end app and it's like whatever, example.com, and you want to pull in a new feature, like your stakeholder or your business, your CEO tells you, hey, I want to add this feature, and then as an engineer, you're thinking, well, that feature has nothing. Yeah, I see how it would be great, but it's completely should be separate. And then when we're thinking from an engineering perspective, we think like, hey, I can just build this. For example, like if you have a content management where you have posts and videos and whatever, and you want to add a chat capability to it. Well, the chat can be built separate from your CMS. Like your content management platform does not have to be intermingled with the chat module. So to have a clean start and just keep things separate is also a very good thing, right? You keep things separate, and it goes back to the foundation that we all learn in computer engineering or computer science, which is separations of concern. So the front end should be able to pull data from multiple sources, right? So that's one of the goals that I had. So one front end would connect to many back ends. So the architecture would look something like this, right? So generally we would have an Nginx load balancer in front, and then you would have your React app, which is like statically built and compiled. So basically your Nginx is just serving static assets like CSS and JavaScript and HTML, and that's it. It doesn't know anything about like states or anything like that. It just serves the basic stuff. Then basically the React app would connect to the different APIs depending on, it doesn't matter. And sometimes the great thing about this is if there's already someone who built a service out there with an API, you don't even need to spin up your own backend. You can just pay like monthly and then connect to their API and pull data from there into your front end, right? Because the end user doesn't care how many backends you have. They don't care. They just want access to the right data at the right time. So I already talked about this, which is we treat the web browser as a first-class citizen like iOS and Android. So the first thing I had to tackle was the build tool. And initially there was like a few. There was Grunt. There was a bunch of other like, what is it called? Broccoli and Brunch. And a few others. So yeah, in Ruby we just have Rake, right? So it's like one tool. Well, there are other tools, but the predominant one is Rake. So I went with Webpack because that was the predominant one at the time. Who here has used Webpack? Yeah. And has it been fun? Yeah, so I can tell you initially when I started, Webpack was not fun. We had what's called assets pipeline in Rails, and going to Webpack felt like a step backward. But sometimes you have to go back to go forward. So that was okay. So in Rails, we have this thing called the assets pipeline where you just write whatever JavaScript or CoffeeScript you want, whatever the hell you want. And at the end of the day, when you deploy, it would just do one compile, and then it's all done, right? And then we had that like several years ago, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago since Rails 3.1. And the JavaScript community came very late to that pipeline game. So I was surprised to see like, wow, they just got this. Like they just understood that they had to do this. But they did it, and they did it better than assets pipeline. So that's one thing I'll say. So it took me about a month to understand Webpack and the rules and the loaders and all that stuff. Like initially I was like, a JSON loader? Like I thought JSON is like native. Like JSON is like JavaScript object notation. It should be natively done. Like why do I have to use a JSON loader? So at least in Webpack 1, you had to use a JSON loader to load JSON from in your project. And it didn't make a lot of sense, but we did it anyway, and it got better and better. So I want to show a bit of a demo of the kind of like the structure that I've come up with. This is by no means perfect, but it does make a lot of sense if you want to configure it and compile it, and I'm continuously improving on it. So generally we have a Webpack config, right? And it looks something like this. You generally have the entry, and then you have the output, and you have plugins. Who loves plugins? And then you have the dev server config. So I kind of broke it down and put it in like a config folder. So then there's like environment specific things in its environment file. Then we have the include. So we have the app, lib, and vendor. So the way I broke it down is you see here that I have the app folder over here, and then I have the lib and then vendor. So what this entails is that there are multiple scopes to your application. The app directory is going to be code that you manage, that you use, that's basically where you change things all the time. It's your application. It's got your business logic. That's your app folder. Then you have the lib folder, which is maybe it's code base that you maintain that you share across your organization. So you might have like a NPM package that you use. Hey, you've used it in one project and it works for another project. That's what I would put in the lib folder. So generally, things that go in the lib folder would eventually be extracted out into its own NPM package. And that's kind of like the similar idea in Rails, where we have app lib and we have the vendor. And vendor is obviously just stuff from the outside. Like if you haven't been able to download it with NPM or Yarn, then it goes in the vendor where you just copy. Like for example, I have one CSS file here that that I'm using, which I had to copy from an external source, and it's not code that I manage, and it doesn't change very much. It's just there, and it works, and I forget about it. That's kind of like what I have the vendor directory for. And then I have like this code syntax highlighting here that I didn't write, but I want to use in my application, and like there was no NPM package for it, so I just copied the codes and just pasted it in here. And that's the point of the vendor directory. So the lib directory is just like I'll have components or whatever that I can reuse over and over across my application. And in the app is where the main directory structure is. Any questions so far?
What is the between app and component? Why you separate in a different folder?
So the app is like everything that is required to build your application. The component is like, sometimes you have components that are, it works only for like within the scope of your application. But sometimes you have components that work in many applications. So it really depends. But components are something, so this concept of pages and components is something which I've been exploring, and I recently made a video about it on my site, so you can check that out. Yeah. Yeah, so components and pages. Pages are basically something which is, it's that page. It's got a certain structure, right? It's like a whole page. So in one page, you may have many components. And in other pages, you may reuse that component. And that's what you would classify as a component. So this whole design pattern and like convention, I had to come up with on my own. I didn't, I looked at all the solutions, and to be honest, some of the stuff that other people were doing were just overly complex. So I just came up with a lot of my own ideas. And then some of them happen to be similar to what other people are doing anyway, like with the pages and components. I think if you use Next.js, you know that there's components and pages as well. So yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Why say the config directory you have an app folder when that contains
Inside the config folder? Oh, okay. So this is a very simple file. I don't know if you use the HTML Webpack plugin. It's basically allows you to generate your template, your initial template, your index.html for a certain file. So basically what I've done here, I have two apps in my directory, right? So you can think of it as namespaces. So I have two namespaces, and for each namespace, I have a new index. So that's what this is. It's the config for that app to generate the HTML. Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead. So the second thing I had to tackle, which I kind of briefly talked about, is the application architecture. So how is the directory structure going to look like, essentially? Like basically for me, that's application architecture, because setting up your directory is going to, set the precedent for, everyone who's working on your app to understand the concepts. And I talk a little bit about this, which is the components versus pages, and then you have the routing. So how are you going to set up the routes, folder structure, state management, networking, and testing? So all this stuff was a big question mark, like when I started. And so now basically, if you take a look at what I've been working with, it's mostly like all this stuff: React Router, MobX for state management, Fetch. Initially I was using jQuery Ajax, and then I realized that, hey, I use React. Why do I need to use jQuery? Because you can do DOM manipulation with React anyway. So that was another thing a lot of people was doing, which is they were using jQuery Ajax. They were using jQuery, the whole library, just to use the Ajax. So I was like, I don't understand why this is happening, and why is there no better way? And fortunately, I had a friend who was very into JavaScript, and they said, why don't you use Super Agent? And then I had another friend who was like, scrap Super Agent, use Fetch, because Fetch is now going to be standard in the browser. So it took actually talking to people to be able to know that, hey, Fetch is now going to be the standard thing. And then when you jump into Fetch, it has its own API that you have to learn. So, but luckily, Facebook had Jest, which made testing very easy, right? So Jest is nice. I appreciate that from Facebook. And a lot of it was just, I had to use my own experience and my own engineering to come up with solutions. And I'm going to talk about them. As you know, I use MobX for state management, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I already covered pages and components just now. This gentleman asked about the pages and components. So let me talk about routing before I go to state management. So my route is all in just one file. It just basically says, when you reach this route, which component do you render? Very simple, very basic. I liked React Router 3. To be honest, I have no problems with it. And I saw their API. It just seemed like they were trying to do too much. I don't understand why they're trying to go do more with the router. Like one pattern that emerged to me was that we need to have a controller of some sort. Like this is starting to become an MVC framework. And I don't think the JavaScript community realized that, because there's never a mention of controller. The controller is what puts everything together, right? You have your state, you have your data, and then you have your routes, your requests coming in, and then you glue it all up, and then you send it to the view. The view is your React component or React page. So the React Router guys, they're trying to do the role of the controller as well, and I just felt that was just not the right direction for them. I mean, it's okay for now. They've committed to maintaining React Router 3, and so that's, I guess, the silver lining in this situation. So that's my routes. Very simple. Just a simple component that renders all the pages. And then the store. So the store was an interesting thing. Like basically, at this point, the state, I was already building an app. I didn't have a state management. I was just using the React set state. And that was working fine for most of the cases. And then as my application grew, it became more complex. I wanted to do more complex thing, and I had to repeat a lot of code. So I decided, hey, code repetition patterns mean I need to do an abstraction. So I looked for an abstraction, and I found a lot of people were using, at the time, Flux. And then Flux was already on its way out. So I was like, great, I found a solution, and it's already old. So I looked at the next thing, which was, I think, Redux, right? Who here uses Redux? Yeah, so Redux was quite popular, and I started to look into it, and I got a call from a friend of mine who wanted me to help out with some project. So I went to work with his team, and his team mentioned MobX. So I looked at MobX, I looked at Redux, and I was like, hey, MobX, most of the stuff's already done. It's very quick. You just call a few things, and then you're good to go. So I was surprised that MobX wasn't the number one, because clearly for me it was a better solution to get started to build anything with, right? Again, I didn't want to create too many abstractions of my own, so MobX was kind of the way to go. So that's the decision I took, and basically this is the outcome of that. So as you can see, like I've also created my own abstraction layer on top of MobX. I call it Fronto Connect. So I've created this, starting to create these libraries called Fronto, and basically it's just tools to help you build front end a little bit easier. So I'm gonna show you what the most basic Connect class looks like. So basically, if you just do that, you'll be able to make network calls to your REST API, right? We're not talking about GraphQL here at all. It's just all REST. So you import your Connect, and then basically you have this idea of scopes. So what are scopes? Scopes are very, very simple. This is all they are. So if anybody used Laravel or CodeIgniter or Rails here? So yeah, literally it's just you get find by, and then you pass in whatever parameter you want, and then you make that call, you make that request. So it's nice abstraction that you don't have to figure out the URL anymore. It builds a URL for you, makes a call, gets the result, and then you do a callback. So basically, this is, I think, as simple as it gets. Like the status over here is just the response from your server. So if your server responds 200, it's going to execute that callback with the response object. So you could even do something like this. So you can write your own callbacks. So you just get a response object, and then you can traverse it and do whatever you want. And obviously, if you have an error, you can just put the status number like 400 or 422 or whatever, and it would just give you that. It would just call that callback. So that's all it is. That's all scopes are. Very simple. And then so what you do is you go into your app, and then you mix your scopes. So sometimes you have a state that is read-only, so then you mix the readable scope in, and then you can make get calls. And then if you want to be able to write and delete and all that stuff, you can create your own scopes for all that stuff. So So I have a scope here that I share across two apps, and this is what it looks like. So that's what the writable scopes look like. You just write you say that it's a type post, it's a post request, and basically that's it. Yeah, and then you mix that in, and then you're good to go. So all this effort is just to make things a little bit nicer in terms of front-end development. I want it to be like a lot like Rails and Phoenix, where you can just write one command, generate an app, and then you have your stores or your models, whatever you want to call it, that makes a call and gets your data for you. That's essentially all we want to do. And nobody wants to jump through the hoop of learning Webpack and how to build all that assets and whatever. Like nobody wants to do any of that. Nobody wants to have to choose, hey, should I use TypeScript or should I use CoffeeScript or should I use Elm or should I use Babel and then like which presets I want. Nobody wants to do that, right? People want to do that later when they get good and they know, hey, I want to use this feature, let me add that in. So the idea is we want to create this structure and then like once people get good, they can go on their own and figure it out and do whatever it is that they want to do. So all this code, and let me show you a little bit of what it looks like. So this is what the app looks like, and it's basically the new version of my school. And so basically it makes it a lot nicer to browse around, and the difference is like having a paged system where you have the server kind of like when you switch the page, a server read rendering. One of the things I learned as well is that when you have everything rendered on the front side, it's very fast, and it's very fast, and that's why we actually do what we want to do, which is build everything on the front end because it's fast. It builds a nicer user experience. You could now build a Photoshop in your browser and nobody has to download a thing. You just go to the URL and then you get the app and then you're good to go. And that's kind of like the charm of this whole idea, right? So now it's a lot easier. You click, you get the spinner, you get the animation. All this stuff was, you could do that with jQuery before, but it's still not as slick. Now, with React and everything that we've done so far, it's a lot easier to build something like this. So this is, kind of like it's all that hard work has led up to being able to do something like this, like very quickly. In like 5 minutes, you can generate an app, put up some components, put up some pages, and then you're good to go. So having all this stuff, like the loader. So everything that you're seeing here, it's actually making a call. So let me show you the network stack. So you can see the URL here. It's super small. Can you see that? It's the request URL. So everything that I showed you before is what allows us to make this URL very easily. So we just have to write very minimal code to generate all this URL to be able to build and retrieve all this data. So if I go down here, you see it makes another call. So now it's paginated and it's retrieving the data from second page just by scrolling. So everything that I've talked about is kind of like led up to doing something like that. So the next thing I tackled was animation. So how if everything is rendered on the client, everything is very snappy. Everything is like it just pops in, and as someone who cares a lot about UI and UX, it feels really cheap to have stuff just pop in. So that was another thing I looked into, was how to do transitions, right? We had to kind of create our own transitions. Like before, the server would do the transition for us. That little bit of lag was that transition for us. But now we have to craft our own. And basically, I think at the time there was a React transition, or I don't remember what it is, but there was one solution by Facebook. It was a React plugin or something, like a page transition plugin or something. And I looked at that and I was wondering, like, why are they trying to reinvent the wheel again? Like, I didn't understand. So if the web browser is a first-class citizen, like Android, in iOS, if you look at the iOS app, we have very smooth transitions. Like when you unlock, your icons kind of like transition in, they animate in, and that's what makes it look nice. So I wanted that same experience. So what I did was I looked into something very simple. It was, who has used this library before? So totally underrated library. I'll show you what I did. So if you see here, like everything that I showed you before, all that animation, okay, the images are broken, I don't know why, but all the animation that you saw before is all built on okay, my Wi-Fi is not working. It's all built on that animate CSS library. So all I had to do was just add a animated fade-in class, just using that library. And that's it, animation done. And nobody was doing this on the web. I don't understand why. Anybody who was building React, I was looking at blog posts and every other solution, like someone was trying to create a new library for something that was already solved. So that was another big thing that I didn't understand why. And that's all the code that it took to create that animation that's, you know, fade in animation and slide down and all that stuff. So I have only 5 minutes left. Okay, so the next thing we have to tackle is the SEO friendliness. I'm going to go a little bit faster. Some apps need it, and I disagree with server-side rendering because some libraries don't work, and you have to make your app universal, which, you know, I don't understand why. Like, you know, the goal is to separate the front end from the back end. So, you know, React is for building user interfaces, not machine interface. So this was something that I disagreed with a lot in the JavaScript community. So here's how I'm proposing to do it. Basically, when a browser accesses your site, they get the React app, and then they get served the static HTML, your React app, basically with all the nice animation and everything. And then when a bot accesses your server, they get served HTML that's friendly for them. Now, I mean, in iOS apps, you don't have to do bot friendly because you know you're building for the user. So why do we have to take that responsibility for your front end? Like, it makes no sense. So I'm proposing something which is a lot simpler. You have some very basic HTML, and you know, this SEO, these bots change all the time. So you know, now there's this standard called JSON LD. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. Google's been talking about it, and if you want to do structured data, you have to use JSON LD. So, you know, that's like, it just makes me ask the question of why do I need to make my React app SEO friendly, right? Why can't I just have a simple HTML template on the server that's returning the same data, so we're not breaking any rules with Google here, but in a machine-friendly format, right? So the fifth major thing is like to have repeatability. That's why this whole thing, this whole talk is, you know, I'm doing this whole talk. So React Router, yeah, it's changing a lot, so I don't know if it's repeatable. MobX hasn't changed very much. I've been able to upgrade from one version to another without it having changing. So MobX was definitely a great choice. Fetch, standard API in browsers, all browsers are adopting it, and you can use a shim to make it support older browsers. So yeah, that's the way to go. And Jest kind of just works. Most of it works out of the box. It didn't take long to figure out, so that's good. So then it comes down to, like, you know, the other parts, which is like having to do my own engineering and my own experience. What about all that? So I've already started to extract certain parts. So there's already some basic documentation. Okay.หมดเวลาครับ Okay, so if you want to check out some libraries I've written, you can do that. Okay, that's all the time I have, so thank you. But you can always approach and, you know, talk to me, ask any questions. If you're looking to learn React, head over to my site and yeah, shoot me some questions. Thank you.